Hello and welcome to the Art of Venice. I am so excited to have you join us on this journey through Venetian art. This is going to be a highlight, about an hour highlight tour of the Art of Venice in preparation for the Masters of Venice series, which I'm launching in April. That will really delve in to each of these artists and themes within Venetian art. And I hope you will join us for that course. It's going to be a lot of fun. And we'll talk about some of the details later. But to start off, I'll introduce myself. My name is Adele, and I am an art lover. I love art history. I have a background in music business and business, but I've taken a lot of college level art history classes. I'm an artist myself. I have a paint shop where I sell my acrylic paintings, Adele Laster Creative, delasterart.com. So I've always loved art and exploring art. And the Masters of Venice, Venetian artists, have always interested me because they're very unique and diverse in their skill and acumen. And the history of Venice is very rich. From being the queen of the Adriatic, this trading empire, its influence with Constantinople to Rome and beyond. It's really interesting. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to welcome you to Venice. We're going to learn about the art of the Adriatic and kind of give you just a 360-degree overview of Venetian art. It's going to be a lot of information, but hopefully a lot of fun and interesting to you today. And then kind of prep you for what we're going to be doing in more depth in our upcoming class, the Masters of Venice. But we'll start with a couple of my some images from Venice. So we have on the left this beautiful portrait of Mary and baby Jesus, the Blessed Mother. It's called Madonna of the Trees. It's in the Accademia inside of Venice. That's one of their main art museums, which we'll be touring in the course. Bellini is a character, is a wonderful artist we're going to be talking about later today, but also at depth in the class. He's from a major art family and was really one of the masters of the Renaissance painting of Venetian art. The middle painting you see, which is kind of overlayered on top of another painting that we're going to talk about in a little bit, is Veronese's Baptism of Christ. This is actually one of my favorite paintings, period, of the Renaissance. It's local to me. It's in the North Carolina Museum of Art, where I'm based. I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina. So this is part of our collection. It's the People's Collection, we call it, because it's a state museum. This is in the free gallery. And I love to just sit there and just look at this scene. I mean, the water looks like it's actually flowing. It's just kind of trickling, the Jordan just kind of trickling in that little pool. And then John the Baptist is, bringing that baptismal water down. You can kind of see God, his light coming down on his son, and the angel over in the corner. So it's a gorgeous painting, and it kind of signifies the later Venetian style, which we'll talk about Veronese too. And on the right, that is a picture I took of glorious St. Mark's Basilica, which is the heartbeat of Venice. St. Mark's is unlike any other church building you've ever seen. And even if you've seen pictures of it, I can tell you I'd studied it at length. I'd taken classes on it until I actually stood there and walked in. I never really fully understood the scope and the breadth and just the awe-inspiring beauty of that place. It truly is kind of heaven coming down to earth, which is heavily influenced by the Byzantium style. Although St. Mark's does have other influences as well, but we'll be getting into that in just a second. All right, so we're going to start off today before we get into the art. It's important to prime you with the history of Venice. Venice has a very unique and dramatic history, as does, I guess, most histories of human history as it unfolds. History itself is a drama, and you don't need Netflix. You just study it, and you're like, wow, this is an epic saga, right? Well, Venice is definitely one of the most unusual histories in Italy because essentially what happened is after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the fifth century AD, which like around 476 AD, there was a lot of divisions and factions. And I'm going to take a step back because we're not going to get into the entire history of Rome and the fall of Rome. That would take an entire class, an entire course, really. But essentially, what happened is when Constantine, Emperor Constantine, in around 300, he was in power. He was a very powerful, respected emperor. He actually legalized and legitimized Christianity, and his mother, Saint Helena, is very popular in a lot of art and veneration in art. Um, he realized that Roman Empire was huge. I mean, in scope and keeping up with everything and the bureaucracy, you really needed two centers of operation. You didn't need just to have Rome, the city of Rome. You needed really to have an Eastern and a Western capital, because it was just hard. It was hard to manage things, say in the Middle East and Asia and Asia Minor and that whole area versus maybe what were the priorities that you were facing in the Western side of the empire. And this seemed to work for a while. Constantine, he went to Constantinople, what we now know as Istanbul, and he really built up this city and, built churches in government. And eventually, Constantinople became more of the center of Rome versus Rome itself, mainly because of trading, um, you know, just civilization, the way things were, the way the overall empire and trends in the empire were going. So Constantinople was always very strong. It continued to exist until 1453 as really the Roman Empire. It just was known as the Byzantine Empire because the eastern side of the empire was known as Byzantium. Unfortunately, in the West, there are a lot of other factors that caused the fall, quote unquote, fall of Rome. Um, everything from invasions by Germanic peoples, the Huns, what we call barbarians, which I'll get to that in a second. There's also issues with the economy, social economic issues, decaying of infrastructure, various things that could lead to issues within a civilization, right? And it did. It was a couple of centuries actually, where it kind of started to go down in generations and then slowly finally kind of collapsed with this invasion in 476 we all hear about, and then afterwards. And it really caused a lot of issues in that area of Italy and up to northern Italy. Because what happened is you had these barbarians who invaded. Now, I want to start by giving you the history of what is a barbarian. Because I know when I hear the word barbarian, I think barbaric. I'm like, they're so terrible. It's like evil people, terrible barbarians, right? Uh, but actually, and yes, some of them were. Some of these invaders were very brutal. No offense, the Huns, they could be very brutal. Some of these were just pillaging, bringing down villages. I mean, you see that later in Europe with like the Vikings. I mean, there's different histories there, right? But barbarian actually is just someone who's not Roman. So the word barbarian comes from a Greek word, actually, because the Greeks, when they heard other languages, they're like, it sounds weird. It's not Greek. We might say it's all Greek to me, right? To borrow Shakespeare, but to them, they're like, this does not sound like our language. To them, they said it sounds like bar, 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 bar. So they started calling these peoples who are not Greek barbarians. And the Romans, who eventually, kind of took over Greece and idolized Greece, really took a lot of their culture and aspects of even from their language. Basically, started using the term as well to mean anyone who is not a Roman. The only reason I point this out is because poor barbarians, some of them do get a bad rap some of them justly. But what happened was all of these Germanic tribes, like the Ostrogoths and the Huns, and various tribes from all over Northern Europe and Eastern Europe, like Northeastern Europe, they started like coming into Italy and trying to take land, the Lombards. And it was a disaster. I mean, there was like pillaging, you know, destruction. There's like shortages of food. Actually, the way Rome finally fell was like they cut off the aqueducts, they had no water. People were like freaking out. And a lot of people are like, look, we're just trying to live our lives. Put yourself in their shoes. Think about situations in modern time. I want to live my life. I don't want to be in this drama. We're going to move. We're going to move far away. So it's decided that, there's this area near present day Venice, and it was a lagoon, and it had all these islands, and they were not livable. I mean, it was like kind of a nasty marsh. I mean, it's scenic coast, but it's like mosquitoes were there. You had like no clean water. It just was not really a pleasant place to live. You wouldn't choose to live there. But that's what they thought. They said, well, if nobody's choosing to live here, well, maybe we can live here and not be bothered by these Huns and Ostrogoths and Visigoths and everyone else and just be safe. And so they did that. They moved into the Venetian lagoon. And essentially, they're very smart. Obviously, it makes sense being from the Roman tradition of engineering. And they took these wood pilings, like probably thousands of them, and just dug them into the ground, into the sand and the mud and these islands. And then they put wood on top and built these platforms. And they built their buildings on top of these platforms and made like a water world city, and then to get to all these islands, which are very close to get together. When you go to Venice, you literally like cross a bridge. You're on maybe one of the islands. It's 100 islands total that create like kind of Venice proper. And that doesn't include, like some of the other islands like Murano and Burano and things like that. But they had hundreds of bridges that you have to cross to get around, and they built it up. And, at first it was pretty hard, figuring out the running water. They ended up doing like rainwater and saved it for their pure water and their fountains and things like that. But they figured it out, and were very ingenious about it. For a while, they ended up becoming part of Byzantium. And that's because when the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire fell, they lost a lot of territory throughout Italy, what we now think of as Italy. And they kind of were like trying to get it back for like 150 years, right? Well, they finally were able to get most of northern Italy back under their control by 540 AD with Justinian. He was emperor, a very famous emperor who built Hagia Sophia. You may be familiar with that, in Constantinople, aka Istanbul today. And he decided that he wanted to reestablish the city of Ravenna, which is maybe like an hour and a half south of Venice, is the territorial capital of his newly acquired reacquired territory of the Western Roman Empire. And he kind of set up a government there, and he built these beautiful churches, which we're going to actually do kind of a side trip on this masterclass during the course on Ravenna, and like this San Vitale church, which is kind of like a St. Mark's in the sense it has these beautiful mosaics, and it's one of the oldest churches in Italy. It was built in 540 AD, which in itself is pretty amazing if you consider all the issues that have gone through war and earthquakes and everything, that it still stands. But I bring this up because Venice, for a very long time, for a couple hundred years, was really super tied to that Byzantium rule, and very influenced in the Byzantium style, the mosaics, taking the glass and turning it into these beautiful mosaics depicting like the Virgin Mary and Christ and things like that, and the iconography of of the Byzantine Empire. So that's something that you'll see throughout Venice. And it did shape and it continues to shape a lot of the art and architecture you see in Venice today. Well, by the mid 700s, Venice had become its kind of its own power. It was building like kind of a mini sea empire even that early, and it ended up rebelling against the Byzantine, and Constantinople decided it wanted to rule itself. It succeeded after a couple of battles and things like that. And it created its own republic, which it would call the most serene republic, because unlike a lot of other countries or regions at the time and throughout the next 1,000 years, they didn't want to have a monarchy. They didn't want to have an emperor. They didn't want any of that. Granted, they did have their noble class. They did want to, as always, it seems, have the elite ruling in some capacity, but it was elected. It was an elected kind of group of officials headed by something called a doge, Doge. And the doge, for the most part, it kind of changes throughout the centuries, was elected by a body, maybe not the whole populace, but a body of representatives. And he had really no power, but he was like a constitutional monarch and a symbol of Venice. So Venice remained a republic in spite of a couple of failed coup attempts until Napoleon came in 1797. And that was a dark day for Venice. The day the Republic the sun set on the Republic. The reason I bring all this up is because Venice is mixed with the East. It was a trading empire. Venice, being right on the sea and its ties to Constantinople, was heavily influenced by multiple different regions, and their art and their influence and their thought throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And it played a pivotal role. I mean, it really was a center of trade, negotiation, and what news on the Rialto? Like, what's going on in Venice? It was affecting kind of the entire area, or could potentially affect the entire world regime. And it was like that really until the New World was discovered and then some other trade routes opened. But most of the trade went through Venice, from the east to Venice. And that influenced their culture and made it very unique and different than maybe what you see in Florence, or you see in Rome, or you see even in France, or if you even, of course, go to England throughout these periods. And it sets it apart. So we're going to talk about that in this class through Byzantium to the High Renaissance. And some of the shifts and what made Venice unique in its position that put it in a state where it could help kind of make changes in the art world, even if they weren't as monumental, it seems at first, as maybe Florence in the Renaissance. So, just a couple of things to keep in mind about Venice that we're going to get into in more depth in the class and talk about the art related to it. Venice became a superpower by the 1400s. I mean, and really earlier, let's just say the high Middle Ages through the mid Renaissance and beyond. It was the sea power, if you will, of trade. They were the shipbuilding capital, basically, of Europe. They had building ships down to a science. And there's a museum actually in Venice where you can learn about this in the art of shipbuilding. And as they got bigger and as they got, prominent, they're like, we're our own republic. Said, you know what? We need to build a beautiful basilica. And we want to honor St. Mark and add him as our patron saint. At the time, their patron saint had actually been St. Theodore, who was a lesser known Byzantine saint, kind of like a St. George. He slays this dragon thing. He's a good saint. Nothing wrong with St. Theodore, but they decided, you know what? St. Mark, there's a legend that St. Mark came to Venice when he was preaching the gospel in this area. He camped out on these islands during a storm, and we want to bring him back here. We want St. Mark. Now, as crazy as this sounds, you can't make it up, because The Venetian government and some tradesmen from Venice, they actually went and they were like raiders of the lost art because they were raiding. They went all the way to Alexandria in Egypt, where Mark is buried, was buried, and he died as a martyr. And they stole his body. Now, it was for the good, in their opinion, because at the time, the area was under Muslim territory and rule, and the bodies of the saints and the martyrs of Christendom were not really a priority. Some got destroyed. It wasn't really, they weren't venerating them because it was a different, faith system, right? So, in their view, they were going and not just stealing his body, they were rescuing his body to take him to his own church in a safe place of refuge so he could, have a peaceful burial there, even though he's in heaven, how these things go. And then pilgrims could come to Venice to venerate St. Mark. Now, I'm a Catholic Christian, and I grew up kind of in the Anglican tradition as well. And saints, when you say venerate, you don't mean you worship a saint. It's more like you admire the qualities of the saint, what they did. You want to kind of learn from them because they were tempted, they struggled, they had this battle with, being tested, and they overcame it, right? So they could get to heaven and um, be one with God for all time. And because of that, you often are said to invoke the saints, ask for them to pray for you on your behalf to God as an intercessor. And this was very important, especially in the Middle Ages. Churches were built around relics, around saints. And that's why it was so important to them to get St. Mark's body, to bring it to Venice, and then to have him be their patron, their protector, and build him this beautiful basilica. Well, they did that in 828 AD. Got Mark, got his body. And the funny story is on the way back to Venice, it said that they almost crashed. They got in this terrible storm, like the worst storm ever. Like, just, the hurricane, the eye of the hurricane. And all of a sudden, Mark appears and he calms the storm. He's like, I don't want you to lose my body. You got to get back to Venice. This is, I'm calming the storm. And, you know, this, whether it happened or didn't happen, it's a great story, right? And who knows? I believe in miracles. But Mark got to Venice, and they initially built a church in 828. It burned down shortly after they got his body. Then they built another one, and it was destroyed. So they finally built the current St. Mark's. It opened in 1094, but it didn't really fully get completed until like the 1700s, because with things like this, people keep adding on. Think about your own place of worship, or heck, even your house. You keep adding things on, as time goes on, as you need more room or whatever. But it essentially opened in 1094. This was monumental because it put Venice on the map for having St. Mark, and it also that church is very unique. And we're going to do an entire lecture just on St. Mark's because it shows the style of Byzantium. And also, they're coming a new Constantinople. That was the mark that Venice wanted to make. We are a Western Constantinople. We are even better than Constantinople, which is kind of, a little bit of a back and forth war there, which we'll get into that history when we talk about St. Mark's and how they actually, a lot of the loot that Venice has at St. Mark's actually was stolen from Constantinople in 1204. But I digress. We'll continue on with the art today. So pause for a second and just look at this beautiful work of Byzantine mosaic art. This is in St. Mark's Basilica in the heart of Venice. There are thousands of tessera, which are these little squares that make up the glass and the gold and the fragments that create these mosaics. It takes years to build this, and the artistry and craftsmanship is truly uh, remarkable. What you words cannot describe. When you walk into St. Mark's, you automatically see this Byzantine influence because in Byzantium, it wasn't so much about realism. We hear about the Renaissance, how they wanted to make things more real because in the Middle Ages, they just everything was so flat. And it seems so like people were floating in air and not very realistic. Well, part of that was on purpose, to be honest. And you really feel that when you enter St. Mark's or some of these Byzantine churches. Because the idea was when you're going into worship, you don't want to feel like you're grounded to earth. You want to be meeting God in that place where you're receiving communion. You want to feel like heaven is touching earth and you're kind of in a communion together. And a lot of that was accomplished by kind of having your saints. You didn't want them to look like they were just ordinary in the grass. You wanted them to feel heavenly, like you were in a mystical realm. And it's hard to explain that until you actually step into, say, a church like St. Mark's, where you walk in and the first thing you notice is, I really feel like I've stepped into a different plane, like an ethereal plane with all the gold, with all of the mosaic work. And even though some of the figures may seem unrealistic, there's this connection. The Blessed Virgin Mary with her long fingers. That's a big symbol. The long fingers of Blessed Virgin Mary. She's reaching out to help all of the people of God. Christ Pantocrator, ruler of the world, with his hands held in a blessing. All these symbolism, all of this color and light, and it just shocks you into this otherworldly plane. So it might not feel very realistic, but that was the point. And that's what a lot of people fail to see when they look at icons or when they look at Byzantine influence. But you really grasp it and see how they embraced that in Venice and continue to embrace it, even in the Renaissance with some of their building, and created their own unique Venetian style. All right, let's just pause for a second. I know that was a lot of information, but let's stop and just breathe in and out. And just, I want you to imagine yourself in Venice, right there, going along one of the bridges. You've got yourself an espresso from Florian, one of the popular coffee shops, and you're just watching people stroll along the streets and the gondolas go by. Just imagine yourself in that scene. What's really cool about Venetian art is when you move on a couple of hundred years after the Byzantine influence, we're going to meet the Bellini family. And families like artists like Bellini, the Bellinis, they really work to capture real life in addition to the saints and Blessed Virgin Mary. They wanted you to feel like you could step into St. Mark's and into a procession, or as you see in this beautiful painting by Gentile Bellini on the left. This is the True Cross. It fell into the bridge of San Lorenzo by San Lorenzo in the canal waters. Look at all the people. This is based on a true story, so they say, rushing into the water, looking for that relic. And as they find it, they emerge from the water. And it's almost like that person's floating, but you have all these realistic expressions, all these people crowding in. The buildings look real, the detail. You start to see that emerge more in the Renaissance, but the Venetians are particularly talented at bringing out that real to life, kind of what I call cinema of art, cinema of space, where you just feel like you're right there in that scene. So who are these Bellinis? This is a family of artists, and they forever changed the course of Venetian art. And they're some of my favorite artists because they capture the color and light so fantastically. So it starts with Jacopo. He was the father of Gentili and Giovanni, and they're a master family of artists. Jacopo's art, unfortunately, is not, there's not too many samples of his art left. There's a few drawings and things like that. But there's some good records about him. And it is believed that he worked under Gentile de Fabriano, who is one of the leading painters of his day. You can actually see some of his pieces like in the Accademia in Venice and also in, like, the Uffizi in Florence. So he was a very learned man. And he actually went to Florence, and that is where he was introduced to linear perspective, which, if you followed the Art Expeditions blog, we talked about that on Renaissance Wednesday. An artist, Masaccio, and then an architect and sculptor, Brunelleschi, kind of together. Brunelleschi was the first to actually write it down, but they're the first to use this concept of perspective, which makes things a lot more realistic and brings you out of kind of that flat, almost floating feel, ethereal feel, to like a more grounded reality in a painting. So Jacopo was he was introduced to this perspective in Florence, and he brought it back to his sons, who are also amazing painters. So Gentile, he was the official painter of the Doges. So that was a pretty big deal, right? Um, and in fact, when Constantinople actually fell to, unfortunately, at the time, fell to the Turks in this terrible war in 1453, Venice wanted to make peace because, let's face it, that was a trading partner. Their long history of Byzantium and relationships with them. And the Sultan at the time, who had taken over, Mehmet, he loved Venetian art. He loved Venice, and he wanted to make, that connection. So he actually asked to have his portrait painted by a Venetian artist because he knew they were the best. And the Doges, they sent the Doge, he sent Gentile to go over there. And that painting, which we will study in the course, is actually in the National Gallery in London. And it's pretty cool just to think of the diplomatic relations and how art could, kind of bring people together even after like a war and kind of this feud in different cultures and religions. So he's most known for the painting we just saw, the miracle, the true cross. But he's also known for this Feast of Corpus Christi, which we'll be studying in the class as well at St. Mark's Square. Uh, he lived, both of these brothers lived a really long life. Gentile lived till he was, I think, 78. And Giovanni, his brother, lived to be 86. It's a long time back then. And they worked until the end. In fact, the Corpus Christi and St. Mark's Square painting, uh, Gentile, his brother Giovanni, finished it because he worked on it like basically till he died, and then it got picked up by his brother. And they did work together quite a lot on a lot of projects. You'll see that, where it has both their names because they were working on the project in tandem. So Giovanni, one thing that he's kind of a little bit more well known just because more of his artwork is in major museums, just because of collections and availability. Although they're both very well known and of the same stature. What Giovanni is really known for is his depictions of the Blessed Mother and Jesus, and he does them in a wide variety of ways. Like we saw in the previous slide, this beautiful Mother Mary, she's looking out, kind of contemplating, you know, oh, the mercy of God, and Jesus is looking right at us, right? Very comfortable in his mother's arms. But he's also done some other interpretations where the Blessed Mother is like all in black behind her, and she's kind of like pensively looking out, thinking about the passion her son has to endure. He was a master at it because you think, how many times can you paint the Blessed Virgin Mary and Christ as one artist and have it feel original and fresh and not get tired of it? But he does it time and time again. I mean, it's amazing. just his depth and his color. He also is very good at painting portraits of people like the Doge, other people of his time. And portraiture is very hard, but his portraits are so detailed, they look like photographs, which we'll see in a second with the Doge painting, which is popular in the London National Gallery. So we'll pause right now for a fun fact because I know I'm loading you with a bunch of information, but uh, Gentile and Giovanni's brother in law was actually another famous artist who we'll hopefully get to know in this class, but definitely on art expeditions. The Paduan painter Andre Mantegna. Now, Mantegna is known for doing a lot of work, like in the Basilica of San Antonio, St. Anthony. He was heavily influenced by Donatello and kind of got to know Donatello and Padua. So you're kind of getting this feeling about these 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? These degrees of artist. So you have Mantegna, and then he kind of knows Donatello, and then Donatello knows people in Florence. So there's this kind of circle of art and exchange of ideas that starts to go around. So it's not just isolated to one area. Stop here for a second and just look at this phenomenal painting of the Doge. This is when I saw it in London when I was like 18, the National Gallery. I was flabbergasted. I was like, is this a painting? Is this a photograph? This is so detailed. I've never seen anything. Even, he's very content. You can tell he's serene. He's that servant of his state. But he also has those lines, those age of kind of holding the weight of his republic, caring about Venice. And look at the detail. Just look at all of that intricate detail on his clothes. You can just imagine you're picking up that fabric, at a store, like a fine fabric store, and just looking at it with the kind of the gold shimmer. It's truly amazing. And that's really what Bellini specialized in. And this was so new. If you look at this compared to like a Byzantine icon, they're both beautiful pieces of work, of art. They both speak to the heart, but they're different and do it in different ways. And this really brings you in to feel like you're actually having a conversation with this person and they're right in front of you. Just the detail is fantastic. So before we go to the next artist, we'll just keep looking at our friend here, the Doge. And I want to kind of talk to you a little bit about some shifts in art. So it used to be that primarily the main artistic tempera paint, and I was using like a tempera, like egg tempera or fresco, which you usually could do dry, where you paint it right on the wall, or the preferred method would be like the Sistine Chapel, where you do it into the wet plaster and it sticks for basically forever. Or in Venice, they would use mosaics because mosaics pretty much never go away. I mean, you do have to replace them and maintain the tessera, but it's pretty foolproof. Well, a new paint form emerged in this time of the early Renaissance that has forever changed painting. I mean, it's still probably the preferred medium of most artists, and that's oil paints. Oil paints kind of originated in Northern Europe. One of the first artists to use them was actually Jan van Eyck, who we will study in art expeditions in a future course. But he's known also for his deep detail. And I'm going to kind of transition into that in a second because I want you to think about this interplay of communication in Venice as a trade hub, kind of going all over Europe. Venice is a center of trade. So when you're trading, you get the news from all over, from Asia to Northern Europe. You're getting not only the latest news, you're getting the latest fashions, the latest innovations, because you're trading. You're having people going all over. They're in different ports. They're bartering. They're selling their goods. They're getting new goods from those ports. So they're able to really learn very quickly and be introduced to things that maybe a town like Florence, which was also very powerful, might not get being, you know, in its particular location. So uh, Jan van Eyck, he started to paint. He's one of the first artists in Netherlands to start painting with oil. And it revolutionized everything because you don't have to do it right away. You can kind of take your time. It's slow to dry. It allows you to have a lot more precision with detail and allow you to even do paintings like this painting of the Doge, which really are not, they're possible, but it's a lot harder to do with like a tempera or a fresco paint, which of course Michelangelo and, and Botticelli did a pretty good job, but it definitely revolutionized things. So, because of their trade route, with not just going to the east in Constantinople, Venice also went all the way up to the Venetians were always sending their trading up to England and to the Netherlands, Antwerp, right? They were one of the first, and actually the first city in Italy to get oil paints. And not only were they the first to get it because of trade, they're the first to adopt it because it was really practical for them. You think about you're on a lagoon. It's like humid. Think about trying to paint a wall when it's super humid and you're having flooding and things dry out and then they get humid again. It's pain. That's why they really honestly preferred mosaics. They're foolproof. You don't have to worry about them, chipping and things like that in the traditional way of paint. Well, oil gave them a little more flexibility. So artists like Bellini and Carpacchio, which we're getting to in a second, were some of the first to adopt it. And not only adopt it, but really master it and bring it into their painting. To the point that they inspired Leonardo da Vinci, who, while visiting Venice, was first introduced to oil paints. And he fell in love with the medium. He liked to experiment with paints, which is a topic for another day. Sometimes to his benefit, and other times not. But he was one of the first to really take on and just really go to town with oil paints, and it was all introduced to him in Venice. So I wanted to kind of preface that because Venice, that was a huge contribution in kind of drawing, that oil painting and that innovative new style into the rest of Italy. And of course, into other areas of Europe as well. So we're going to kind of speed through this, but this is one of my favorite painters, Vittorio Carpaccio. And this is the line of St. Mark. This is one of the most famous and important paintings he did. Not just because it's a really interesting painting of this regal and, kind of warrior Mark. He's like, I'm bringing peace, but I'm also, here to defend the city of Venice. Um, this lion of Saint Mark, but also because of where it is located. It is actually was made for the ducal palace, where the laws were made in Venice, and it was really an emblem of Venice. It wasn't just like this is a cool painting. This was meant to be like this is a symbol of Venice and our republic and the strength of our republic. So I was so blessed because I went to the National Gallery in DC on a trip in December, and they had a Carpaccio exhibit. And I wasn't even up there for that, actually. We were specifically just wanted to go to the museum and see the collection. Uh, and I fell in love with his work. I mean, he, as I learned at the exhibit, he's not really well known. I was familiar with him, but he's not very well known outside of Venice, which is unfortunate, but he's always been beloved in Venice. For one, you look at this amazing painting, which is like the symbol of the Venetian Empire, the line of Saint Mark. But this exhibit kind of just told the story of Carpaccio and his talent and his drama. And he continues to be one of the most popular Venetian painters among art historians, but he's not as widely known. So we'll kind of scooch over here to the next slide, and I'll learn a little bit more. Now, before I go any further, probably like, what's with all the lions? What's with the line of St. Mark? Well, in Revelation, there is a verse that references a lion, and an ox and some other animals that are kind of tied to directly to the four gospel writers. And Mark is always associated with the lion. So this is his emblem, and it symbolizes his gospel and the saint. So anytime you see the line of Saint Mark, or you see a lion tied to Saint Mark, that is why. It's not just like Mark was actually a lion. It's all symbolic. And that's one thing we'll get into a lot in this course is there's a lot of symbolism throughout art, not just in this period, but especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And once you learn the secret language of art and symbolism, it makes it come alive because you're like, oh, that's why there's a lion there. That's why there's a lily, or that's why Mary's wearing blue. Yeah, and it's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So we're definitely going to get into that, but that's the line of Saint Mark, in case you're wondering. But Carpaccio was born in Venice in 1460, and he studied under the Bellinis, and he was also influenced, by other Italian artists at the time as well. One thing that really sets him apart is kind of, you can see his influence by the Netherlandish painting that we were talking about, how they had some of that influence and trade with the Netherlands and with Northern Europe, even though they're not right beside each other, because they had like that detail in creating these commanding scenes and extreme detail about every subject in the painting, which you see with St. George and the dragon with Carpaccio. And even the line of St. Mark that we just saw. He explored themes of death, and sometimes in kind of brutal ways. You're like, wow, I feel like this is a scene from the Lord of the Rings, where the orcs just like destroyed everything. I mean, very realistic. I mean, it's like, as they say, he was the creator of Renaissance form of cinema. When you go to see a Carpaccio painting, you're going to the movies essentially, because he's telling such a story with his art. You feel like you're in an action movie, especially his panel paintings, The Life of St. Ursula, which are like 9 panels. They include all these different paintings of stories about this interesting saint. And, there's invasions, and then there's dreams that she has, and then it's her martyrdom. And it's like a great big epic, right? And it's all painted, but it feels like you're going to a movie. That's Carpaccio. Now, if you Google Carpaccio today, which I'm sure he's honored by this, but you're not going to get the artist on the first page of Google, because he has been immortalized. His talent has been immortalized as a food dish. In 1963, they were having a really big retrospective of all his work in Venice. It was this art museum was doing this Carpaccio exhibit, and to celebrate, what they decided to do is to create this Carpaccio menu. And one of the things they did is the chef came up with a new dish. It was a thinly sliced beef, like raw, and he named it after the painter because the steak was inspired by the artist's vivid red colors. Well, it became a very popular dish, especially in the US. It's still very popular. So Carpaccio was honored by this dish, but now when you Google his name, you're probably going to get all these recipes for Carpaccio instead of the artist. But it does it gets his name from him. So next time you eat that at an Italian restaurant, or maybe treat yourself to some Carpaccio after a Carpaccio lesson in the series. I know that we're running a little bit short on time, so I want to get through this but not rush. We're going to skip ahead to Giorgione and Titian. And I put them together because they trained together under Bellini, the Bellinis. And Giorgione actually was a little more senior in his training than Titian. So Titian actually, his early training, a lot of it came from Giorgione. They worked together. And you see Giorgione on the left, his woman, doesn't she speak to you? I mean, he's not trying to just make something to be beautiful or to be, the saintly like perfection. No, he has this real life person who looks like she's carrying some type of, like, to me, I'm like, that's the bills, right? And you're just tired and you're like, I've just, it's been like a hard day. And you're like facing this bubonic plague in your neighborhood at the time. He captures that feeling where you just feel this woman, but then she's persistent. She has like this persistence and this dogged, like expression, like, yeah, I'm tired. Yeah, I'm frustrated, but I'm gonna take it. I'm a Venetian. And that's Giorgione. He had that really kind of poetic and ability with paint. And sadly, he died so young. There was an outbreak of the bubonic plague. So when he was 30, he died tragically. And it was mourned at the time to the point that, I mean, people are trying to get his art, any of his art that was left for sale, and buy it even in his day. Titian and him were really good friends, and Titian honored him throughout his life, kind of with his art. But Titian himself, who worked on many of Giorgione's pieces once he passed away, the unfinished pieces, so sometimes you'll see them, the works tied together. Titian ended up coming out of this and developing his own style and carrying over from the High Renaissance to kind of the next generation of painting. So, and this is just kind of a recap of what we were talking about. And it was said by Vasari, who was a biographer at the time, that Giorgione was the master of Titian. And then Titian kind of came as a follower and developed this incredible style. Titian, we call him Titian. He's actually Tiziano Vincele. Um, and I'm not the best with Italian, so con permiso. Please forgive me if I don't pronounce it perfectly Italiano, but um, he was known as the sun amidst the stars, and that was recalling a line from Dante to his peers. He was beloved. His talent was immense because he was versatile. He could paint anything from portraits to these major mythological allegories to like these religious subjects. And he had such depth and color and detail and nuance that, I mean, it has inspired generations of painters, his work, including his Rape of Europa in the Elizabeth Gardner Museum in Boston, for instance, was copied by Rubens and even inspired Edouard Manet, the father of Impressionism. It inspired him with his Olympia. So Titian, when we study Titian, we'll learn a lot more too about how he grew as a painter. We have a Titian at our museum in Raleigh, and it's a good painting, but it's kind of, you can see it's early in his career. It doesn't He's still learning. He's kind of like still in that shadow of Giorgione and Bellini, and it's small versus what you see maybe when I went to the Frick collection and saw this portrait in New York, which is very refined. It has this regal background, these, you know, opulent colors on the detail work on the outfit. So he grew a lot as a painter and even kind of catapulted the high Renaissance to like the Mannerist and Baroque kind of styles. All right. So two more in the high Renaissance before we kind of move into the next era. Tintoretto and Veronese. Now, we already talked a little bit about Veronese and how much I love his baptism of Christ, which is in the North Carolina Museum of Art. Tintoretto, though, he was the master of color and bold brushwork. He also kind of really made the shift from the High Renaissance to the Mannerist period, which we'll talk more in detail in the course about what is the Mannerist period. But essentially, it was a shift to being a little more um, a slight style where everything didn't have to be so perfect, so form filling. You had a little more fluidity to a point. But Tintoretto is actually probably best known for creating the largest oil canvas in the world. Um, at least one of them. The last time I checked, it was the largest, but I think it might have been surpassed. But it's huge. It's in the Ducal Palace in Venice, and it tells the El Paradise, kind of the story of the Christian story of paradise and this perfect republic is kind of the symbolism. I think Venice is the perfect republic. He was also commissioned by what you call the scuola or a school, and in Venice, what that was is there's major patrons because a scuola was like an organization or a fraternity where you'd have like a group like the Order of St. Luke, who was, artist or something, or, whatever the group was. But they would have like sometimes a civic thing that they were trying to do, like maybe build a building to help children, or maybe they were just more about focusing on the writings of a certain saint and venerating that saint. There's different ways that the squalas would be involved, but they always had usually a lot of power and they had some money and they liked to have art. So they were one of the big patrons in Venice. He was commissioned by the Scuola de San Roche to design their walls and their ceilings. And it is fantastic if you're in Venice. You have got to go here because it is perfectly preserved for the most part from the way it was when he painted it. And you can really just step in there and imagine yourself in that scene. They also have a lot of good resources on their website, which I'll provide in the class as well to the museums. Now, Veronese, look at that color. Look at his expression and the movement. You feel like you're in the scene and he has command and presence over his medium. He was actually born in Verona, and his name is Paolo Calari, but he's always known as Veronese because he's the man from Verona. He's Veronese. He created a lot of dynamic scenes from religion, myth, reality, and he wasn't really afraid to do what he wanted to do. We'll get into that in the class. If he wanted to put friends in a painting or something, he's like, I'm going to paint it. I'm going to paint it the way I need to paint it. So we'll learn a lot about his masterworks, especially like the Wedding at Cana and the Feast of Levi in the course. Now I paused for a second because I have a cat who is meowing in the background. Her name is Cezanne, and she is kind of our mascot of art expeditions. She's named after the famous painter Cezanne of French post-impressionism. But that being said, if you hear any meows in the background, I apologize. We love our pets, don't we? But Canaletto, we're going to move forward to about 1700s. This is one of my favorite painters because he captures a realism with painting that I've like never seen with any other artist. I mean, you look at a Canaletto and it's a Canaletto because it looks like a photograph. It's so detailed that you can't even believe that this is like a painting. I'm blessed that we have one at the North Carolina Museum of Art. I've also seen a few of his in the Met in New York and the National Gallery in DC. And it just reels you in. It's not only the detail, he creates his life. Like you feel like you're in Venice. You see these gondoliers. You see the people they're trying to get from point A to point B on the Grand Canal. You see the buildings. You can recognize the buildings. There's the sky. It's all of this detail. And Canaletto was a master of this. And he even invented kind of his own style in a way called the vedua or the view painting. And it shows cityscapes and landscapes in such remarkable detail. You're like, this is a photograph. You have to remember at the time, they didn't have cameras. There was no photography see something like this was not just a work of art. It's like a historical document of what life was like back in that era. I mean, it really can tell you, how did St. Mark's Square look? What buildings were there? What has changed? Because it was that detailed. And he was also very well traveled, Canaletto. He moved all the way from, he was born in Venice, but he also traveled and worked in London for a time. So he had a lot of experience, and he had seen some other artistic styles, but he always kind of moved back into his Venetian landscapes. That was his focus, is the architecture and beauty of Venice, and really being the person to translate that story to the world through art. Um, and his name is Canaletto, not because he's from Venice, although it works, but because his father, that was his father's name, but his family was long Venetians. And he does. He kind of like is the Canaletto. I always think of him because he paints the canal so well, right? He's a master of the scene. So that's essentially the end of our mini highlight overview today. And I know it was a lot, and I talked a lot, and I apologize. But hopefully it was interesting and gets you excited about art and learning more about art, which is what Expeditions is all about. So I'm gonna kind of pivot here, because if you're interested and you want to learn more about the Art of Venice, because this is just a little bit, this isn't even the icing on the cake. Look, we haven't even gotten to the icing on the cake. There's so many more fantastic Venetian artists and architects and history and stories to tell. And we're going to do it with my class, The Masters of Venice. So, what is this? What are we going to do with this class? I want it to be really accessible to you and fun and easy. So, what I'm thinking is, we're going to have a 2-month on demand course. I'm going to, if you sign up, you'll have the ability to watch the videos at your own time. We'll do focus um, videos on and lectures on different types of periods within Venetian art, but also do some mini videos and mini lectures so it doesn't seem so time consuming. You can kind of do a little bit at a day, because I know it's a lot of information, and you want to enjoy it. Also have some articles and some bonus content for you, and a syllabus so you can follow along and really kind of learn at your own pace and the way that you learn the best. How to sign up? Well, I there is a fee for the class, but the reason is because it costs a certain amount to host the video and to run the website. And this is kind of a nonprofit thing for me. I'm doing this out of a passion for art. So just know that by purchasing, you're supporting the arts and helping to provide arts education. So I'm doing it in 2 different ways. You can sign up for this class if you're interested in art and kind of want to be in the loop for future classes and get bonus articles about different types of art, not just the Art of Venice. I recommend doing Patreon. Patreon is a very popular program because it allows you to contribute to something like Art Expeditions, and you can pick your tier. So I have 3 different tiers. I have Van Gogh's Room for $5 a month. And you'll get a lot of good bonus material in there. And then I have Vermeer's Gallery, which is $10 a month, and you'll get all of the class for Venetia, Masters of Venice in that Vermeer's Gallery. And if you really want to have access to any future classes and just support the mission of this, we have Monet's Garden, which is $25 per month. I'll have all this information, I know it's a lot to take in, on my website, artexpeditions.com. Just click classes, and it's also on the main page under Patreon. Now, I know some people do not like that recurring fee each month. So I am going to offer it where you can just purchase the course, and I'll have details on that soon. And then you'll get access to the course. You'll get access to all the content, the syllabus, everything. Anyone who's in this class will also be in a special Facebook group. And I like that because I've been in those Facebook groups too for when I've taken similar classes. And it builds a community, because what we can do is If you have a question, you're like, hey, I'm wondering this about Canaletto. Can you ask? I can get you the answer, and then we can kind of think about the paintings together and have that good chat and group, so you're not in it alone as you're learning. You can meet some new friends that way too. So just something to keep in mind. I have had a couple of people ask me, they said, Adele, I know you love art. You love art history. We love going to the art museum with you. And you kind of being our private tour guide, but why do people take classes online, art classes online? And the truth is, because it's fun. Art is fun. You don't have to go into be considering getting a master's in art history. You can just take this for fun. It can excite you about maybe if you're going to Venice. Maybe you can't afford to go to Venice right now. So you said, you know what, I'm going to learn about Venice from the comfort of my home, and I'm going to enjoy this class and meet some other people in the Facebook group. The whole point is it's fun, it's interesting. We look at Carpaccio and how he had the cinema, these the storytelling on these great panels through art. Art history is kind of like that. There's there's murders, there's mystery, there's romance behind the scenes and all these paintings and the stories behind these paintings. There's historical figures that are coming together in a drama that is worthy of Netflix. So we're going to learn about all of that and have fun doing it. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this. I know I went a little over the hour, and I appreciate you. Uh, and I'm really excited, no matter what, if you'll just stick with our artexpeditiontours.com for our blog. We have Medieval Mondays. We have Renaissance Wednesdays and Impressionism Fridays. Plus, each week we're going to visit a museum virtually. So that's all free. And then, of course, we have the Patreon where you can really get more inside information and help to support the mission of this. Once again, I'm Adele, and I am so grateful for your time and look forward to continuing our traveling the world through art. Next up, Venice.